Welcome to TAP, everyone. I'm so glad you're here, and I think that you're going to be glad that you came here because this conversation, I think, is going to really enrich us. Listen to this. This is a presentation of my guest today. Shauna Winram is a PhD candidate in the School of Philosophy, College of Arts and Social Sciences, Australian National University. Shauna is a lived experience researcher, having had 3 psychotic episodes in her 20s. Her PhD is entitled Consciousness and the Phenomenology of Psychosis. The Phenomenology of Psychosis. What could possibly top that? That title compelled me, across timelines almost, across time zones, to reach out to you. Well, so welcome to you, Shauna Winram.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for contacting me. It's great.
Yeah, I was like, ah, that I'm so glad that you're researching in this. And I thought maybe a good place to start would be introducing what is the difference between a psychosis and what you call waking consciousness.
Yeah. Well, a, a traditional or a sort of definition of psychosis would be experiences that include things like hallucinations, delusions, disordered thoughts, etc. So it's a disconnection with reality that occurs in illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. But with my research, what I'm doing, I'm within a philosophy department, School of Philosophy at ANU, and we have a certain definition of what consciousness is. And when we talk about consciousness, we mean what's known as phenomenal consciousness, which is like our subjective first person experience. And it's things like sensations, perceptions, emotions, and arguably cognitive types of things. And when you think of thoughts, it's when you have sort of an inner voice, then you'll have a phenomenology to those thoughts. But phenomenal consciousness is very tricky because science can't really account for it, although there are theories that try to account for it. So there's this emerging area, which is the science of consciousness. And in that area, recent work has suggested this sort of multi-dimensional approach to consciousness. So say we have different ways of being conscious, like the normal waking state, being on LSD, being under light anesthetic, or REM dreaming, which you're conscious when you're in REM sleep. We intuitively think that they're different ways of being conscious. And this approach calls those different ways global states, and it suggests that they vary from one another along multiple dimensions. I call these dimensions domains, but they include things like level of arousal. So when you're under light, and if you're in a coma, your arousal's not there. If you're under light anesthetic, you have very low arousal. If you're on amphetamines, you have high arousal. So you sort of have a dimension of arousal that can vary. But that's one dimension. We also have the contents, which, as I said, are things like perceptions and sensations and emotions. And these can vary in terms of their number. So in the normal waking state, we'll have about 4 chunks of information. But if you're on LSD, you might have more information in working memory at a given time. Whereas if you're under light anesthetic, you'll have less. So that's another dimension that can vary when you're in these different experiences, these different ways of being conscious. And the quality of these contents can change. So on LSD, perceptions might be heightened, whereas under light anesthetic, they're less, you know, vivid and
Yeah.
in the normal waking state. So these are dimensions.
Mm.
There's also the structure of consciousness, which can be things like how the self is experienced and how attention is experienced.
I was actually
How
going to ask that in addition to this question because is there an I structure if phenomenology is investigating our subjectivity of our subjective experience,
Yep.
subjectivity, then then is there an eye structure present during a psychosis? Is
Well, okay, this is one of the things I try and test for. Firstly, when you say an I, you talk about a self, and
yeah,
this concept of the self has plays different roles in psychology and philosophy. So, say in philosophy, some people say we don't have a self, and often in Buddhism or whatever, the no self doctrine. Other people say we have a minimal self, which is you have the structure of consciousness, you have this kind of pre-reflective self built in. So, say I experience an orange and a lemon, the quality of those are different, but what's the same is that there's this kind of subjectivity built into it. And some say this is a minimal self, but then we can also have an autobiographical or narrative self. So, for example, at the moment, I have a sense of myself over time,
yeah,
but someone who has damage to, certain parts of memory may be able to speak to you and use language, but they don't remember them. They're caught within a kind of small time frame so that they don't remember the past and the future. So they don't have that self that's extended over time. So,
continue.
yeah, so this idea of a self has different sorts of can be applied to different
Okay.
concepts that mean different things. But in my work, I mean, that is a question that other people have looked at. But
Mm,
in psychosis, how is this self affected?
mm,
And I did a survey, but I also interviewed people, and what you can find is you can have different responses to that. So, for example, one person I interviewed said that their spouse thought they became very childlike when they were psychotic. So it was a really horrible experience, but they were also very childlike. Whereas another person I interviewed seemed to lose that sense of self, like they didn't know who they were. They said, you know, I knew who I was, but I didn't know my name and I didn't know anything about me. So it was like that that sort of autobiographical or narrative self had somehow
mm,
they'd lost that. And
mm,
what I'd suggest to answer your question is so I would suggest that it's experienced differently amongst different people who experience psychosis. In my survey, I found that the self was experienced differently
mm,
during psychosis compared to the normal waking state. There's not one answer to that, how the self is experienced.
yeah.
Like some people may be totally aware of who they are during the psychosis, but the delusional beliefs create this reality around them. And, they're kind of saying, like, why is this happening to me? Like someone who was in the middle of a delusional world where the birds had micro transmitters on them and the CEO was watching them and doing things and all that. And they're kind of like, why is this happening to little old me? Why are they spending all this money to communicate with me or to,
Okay.
use surveillance on me? So they
So
still have.
so that sense could be normal, usual, and then everything else can feel strange. So it's not necessarily that yourself is dissolved. That is kind of that was my thinking in that question. So it's not that it can be experienced very differently.
I
So
think it's different for different. I had uh ideas about what psychosis was because I've had 3 psychotic episodes. So I had my ideas about, that it involves this kind of narrative story and, that happens to you. You're the protagonist and these things are happening. And when I interviewed people, that's not everyone's experience. So people have different experiences. But from my own experience, like during my first 2 psychotic episodes, I was both the second coming and the Antichrist at different points of these
mm,
episodes. And I'd say, like, whilst I still had a sense of myself, but the world I was immersed in, and there was no part of me that realized what was happening to me wasn't real. It seemed like these stories that were happening where I was going on initiation tests, and the sounds in the environment were responses to my thoughts, and there were these higher beings communicating with me, and I had to be humble, and I had to do the right thing, and they'd be cheering and booing, and that I would hear, and all of this, it was all totally real. And in a sense, I was still myself, even like, even though you become so inflated, something like, the second coming, where the earth is going to plummet into Armageddon if you do the wrong thing. It's so inflated, but
I
in a
see.
sense, you're still yourself in that. But this experience, which is, just so huge, is happening to you. But people I spoke to had, some people had that kind of experience,
Mm-hmm.
whereas others, like, for one person, that they collapsed in the street, and there was this overwhelming sound of like choppers, like a helicopter sound, and they had the sense of this sort of it was this invisible snake kind of,
Yeah.
striking at them, and so so
Yeah. So
for that person, it was a very terrifying experience, but it wasn't this kind of grand narrative that, you know.
of
So
everyone. Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, what I did ask people was, you know, did you realize you were in a different reality during the psychosis or not? And that kind of indicates whether people are, part of them is saying, oh, this is a bit strange. This something strange is going on here. So they're aware that it's not quite the normal waking state,
Yeah.
or whether they're totally, there is this total disconnection with reality where there's no awareness that what's occurring, even though what's occurring is, you, you know, is a very big break with reality, but there's no awareness that they're not,
Really.
in it's not reality that's occurring.
So how did people answer that?
Um,
Was like
look,
most of it, or
yeah, I had a mixture. And look, I'll have to say I haven't my my PhD isn't complete yet, so I'm still analyzing data. I've spent the last 2 years working on statistics for the survey, but I have these 16 one-hour interviews, and I haven't gone through all of those, analyzing them yet. But what I found, for example, one participant said, well, it was, and this, for this participant, their psychosis, and it was related to drug use, lasted for about a year, which is, kind of unbelievable. It's really shocking. But what they said, it was their normal reality. So they lived in a certain part of a city, and they would wander around, and that part of the city was part of a game show where everything, everyone in that part of the city were part of this game show that was being watched and being televised. So they lived this life where they felt they were being watched all the time. Their thoughts were being heard. And they said it was the normal reality for me, except more profound and eventful. And the example they gave was they would spend most of their time, if they weren't at the drug dealers or whatever, they'd lost contact with their family. They'd spend most of their time in a housing commission flat, sitting alone, listening to the radio. But the radio would be commenting on their thoughts, and people walking outside would laugh in response to their thoughts. So there was all of they said it was eventful all the time. So even though they would just be sitting alone listening to the radio, it seemed like their whole reality was profound and eventful all the time because, you know,
Yeah, so
they're
I'm getting the sense of, because you can, even if you haven't tried a psychosis, you can compare it to dreaming, right? You mentioned REM sleep earlier. So dreaming, where you also have a little, sometimes an awareness of something strange is going on, but apparently it's just happening. And so when you're describing that, I'm getting the sense that things are gliding together, and some of it could be, some of it could remind me a little bit of some spiritual truth, like, oh, is it all a game, and spirits talking, and but then there's that boundary where it becomes delusional, because if it's not serving you in any way,
yes.
if it's a trap for you, well, then it's not just spiritual force or anything like that. Yeah, trapped in between somehow.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very good point, and you've probably heard people. I mean, there are groups like Icarus in the States that they'll talk about groups that talk about spiritual emergencies or spiritual, talk about psychotic episodes as being these spiritual emergencies.
Right.
And the point you make is very true. If it's not serving you, if it's causing you distress, but this is a question. You have for example, people doing research into psychedelics or talking about mystical experiences, or and 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 what a mystical experience is, and then comparing what we have with psychosis. And look, people have written a paper saying they don't think the mystics were psychotic, and they don't think people with schizophrenia are mystics. But this is a paper I read, and they said these are categorically distinct kind of states. Well, I don't know that they are. Where, for example, mysticism reflects this sort of more real reality that we don't normally have access to, whereas psychosis is this kind of delusion, called the dysfunction of someone's brain, causing this delusion. Well, I would say they're not categorically distinct states. What you have with psychosis, something does go wrong, because these are distressing experiences. But, I think, this is a really interesting question. How are they similar to mystical states or religious experiences? Because the mystics, did have experiences that sound very much like psychosis. Some of the,
Yeah.
so, but we don't want to romanticize experiences that are very difficult and that probably do need treatment, even if a lot of people are not happy with the sort of treatment they get. But I think people definitely need help. And from my own experience, I needed to be sedated for a long time to come out of these experiences. So they're very difficult. But yes, in terms of what they reveal about reality, and this doesn't go into my university work, but in terms of, are these experiences revealing something about reality in the way that mysticism is, that we don't normally have access to? Well, ultimately that's going to depend upon your view of reality. And for someone who's very science-based and believes in, physicalism, which is that all we have is the physical reality, they're going to say, well, no, these experiences aren't reflecting, a greater truth that's somehow distorted, but for people who think, that, physicalism doesn't answer everything. I mean, certainly there seems a gap between our first person experience, or the phenomenology, our experience, and the physical world. And, we don't want to, I only know my own journey in trying to make sense of that. And I can't say I have made sense of that. Like, is that all right?
Yes, it's so all right. It's so all right. I'm like feeling, yeah, I'm feeling what you're saying in my heart. Um, in terms of, well, here in the end, that it's like it's a life process, figuring this out, interpreting it. Also, I guess depending on where you are now in life, then you see it differently than you did earlier, and so I think it's gonna be an ongoing thing, interpreting what happened for you back then, and then also what you said about you had that little side comment, even though people may not be happy how they are getting treatment, then they do need help. I was curious to hear. I know I sent you a list of questions, and I haven't even really gotten to them yet because this. But this is just a little question before we maybe go into that. But so what you study and what you do with your research, do you have any intent of affecting treatment for people if we figure out more around how the consciousness works in psychosis? Can that alter treatment of these patients?
Uh, Look, I mean, my my work is a PhD project, so you've you know, you can't be too grandiose
Okay.
about the implications of your work. And obviously we'd like to think the implication is this is going to show us novel ways of maybe carving up the space. So people talk about taxonomies, or you have something like the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And in a way, that's a classification system that tries to kind of carve up disorders and label these disorders. And you know, my work, I work within a different framework to that, where I'm getting first person reports from people who've been psychotic about how they've experienced these different sort of domains or dimensions of consciousness and tried to rate those on a scale. With 64 participants, they seem to fall into three clusters, where you have one cluster that those participants have higher arousal, and you have another cluster where the function like memory, decision making, behavior is quite low, and you have another cluster that is oh, I can't remember, but you have these three clusters, and for example, and I'm still doing this analysis, but for the high arousal cluster, they scored, say, my four dominant, I have schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression as my four dominant categories. And the high arousal cluster will score highest for schizoaffective and second for bipolar. And they're both kind of mood disorders that have mania. So, and it scored lowest on depression. So you kind of see, are there patterns in the data that, you know, these three clusters, do they kind of tell us anything where we take a sample of people, 64 people have been psychotic, we measure them along 13 different domains of consciousness, and then we do an analysis with statistical software and find that they fall into these three clusters, you know. So it's that a way of kind of carving up this space a bit differently. And in whether, and you're asking me in terms of treatment, I mean, that's obviously when you do a PhD like this, you want to say, well, you know, what's the significance of the work? It could have implications for treatment. But again, it is a PhD work. It's a very preliminary sort of work. And
Sure, but then okay, let's take that down then. The ambition was too high. I get into that often. But what about for yourself? Because you said you had to be sedated for a long time there. Uh, and I mean, just that little sentence you have, whether people are happy about the treatment or not, it must come from somewhere. Like, were you unhappy with the treatment? And what do you think about people being treated? should it be
Okay.
different?
Okay, I'm sorry if I answered the wrong way and
No,
went off
no,
on a
no.
tangent. No, okay, in terms of the treatment, well, with the biomedical model, which is the dominant model, we look at mental disorder in terms of imbalances in neurotransmitters and brain dysfunction, etc. That's what a psychiatrist will do. And most people are treated with medication. Now, I'm not opposed to medication. I'm still on it. I've been on it for, 34 years or something. But what I would say in terms of treatment that people aren't happy with, my treatment, I would say, was okay, except I didn't get the therapeutic support I needed. So I didn't get any in the mental health system. So people, I would say there's a lot of stigma in the mental health system. I would say a lot of mental health consumers feel very disempowered, where their experiences aren't listened to, where perhaps some people get treated poorly, especially in hospital or in the mental health system, by, I'm sure there are many good people working there, but there are also people who have biases that are, quite toxic against people with mental illnesses. And so when I interviewed people, because the participants I interviewed knew that I had lived experience, I was a peer. And I think people were, rather than talking to, say, a doctor or whatever, they were more happy to open up about their experiences. And people, had rather, like, experiences that had traumatized them. And I don't think that's a rare sort of experience. Sometimes the system traumatizes people more than the disorder itself. And another thing, you have a lot of people with mental illnesses who are not flourishing in society. And I often think, not just me thinking, other people think this is because people don't have the right support, because, and there can be economic problems if people can't work, and problems with housing. We have a very big housing problem in Australia, and people not being in relationships, not working. I mean, that there are a lot of reasons, or people being over medicated, for example, as well. So there are a lot of reasons why people don't flourish with these illnesses, and that's not actually because of the disorder. So I think if people do get the right support and respect and care and love, they are much more likely to flourish. And, a lot of people miss out on that.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. Okay, good. So now we know the context here. And so that I think it just underlines, whether what work is going to do it or not, then this underlines the importance of what you are looking into. At least that's the link I'm making. And I'm trying to make it into a question, but my observation is just that when we're talking about multidimensionality as something that we, per definition, are or have, then it's we are less prone to pathologize this and make it into something. Oh, have a certain stigma around a crazy person who went in a psychotic episode, because if we all have, in a way, the access to it, but then there's this thing that can happen, and that's just that uh, then, like you said, we need help if that is to happen. But do you see what I mean? If it's more like accepted that that's a potential in consciousness, or that's a trap in that, something that can happen somehow.
Yeah, I think it's diversity, and there's this quote I saw that biodiversity is necessary, for life on Earth, and neurodiversity is necessary. And like, I just think, rather, and I saw this written somewhere as well, rather than kind of romanticize these illnesses as superpowers or stigmatizing them in some way. They're just part of the expansive experiences that humans have, and they're very human experiences. They are fundamentally, intrinsically very human, and often very profound and very misunderstood. And yes, we shouldn't be stigmatizing them. We don't need to romanticize them, but we need to hold them within a framework, which is, this is human, and this is, and it's suffering as well. So, we greet that with compassion, and,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then that opens up for a whole new way of treating then, if it's in that perspective. Okay, so I'm gonna look now at my questions to you, Shauna. I'm sure we covered a few of them anyway. Uh, yeah, okay. So I was asking. This is because I was looking into your work when I had a cold, and I felt really sorry for myself. So my question here is my consciousness different when I'm sick? Because I felt like a different being when I, in a bubble, sort of. Is that a domain?
Well, look, it's an interesting question. Like, what we could say, what you're asking is at a different global state, and once again, these global states, this is a concept that's been sort of developed, and it's still being tested how robust it is. But with a cold, I mean, if you're kind of
It
not
was
deluded,
bad, bad,
a
bad, bad.
bad cold. um, so it's like, is that a different global? Someone, Cecily Whiteley, has written work arguing that depression is a different global state to the normal waking state, and so what I'd say to answer that is that perhaps there were domains that were different, like maybe your sense of smell was, but
Yeah.
it could have perhaps been a different global state if you were not delusional. What's the term, kind of, I mean, I can't answer your question basically, but I mean, that is, I think it's an interesting question, because it is like, say we're asking if you and I are in the normal waking state
Yeah.
at the same time, and we say, well, for us to be in the same waking state, we have to kind of have a similar rating for these domains. We have to experience them in a similar way. And so how much does your experience of these different aspects of consciousness have to change before you and I are in a different, experiencing a different global state? Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? So if you and I are in the same global state, then we say we score from 1 to 7 along all these different domains of consciousness, and say you and I score 4,
Uh-huh.
4 or 5, which is around the normal waking state. And then say you start scoring 7 and 1 for, how different do you have to be until we're having different experiences?
Interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I can't answer that, because this is
Yeah,
it's
but I like that you accept it as a thing. But I guess you have to do that as a researcher in phenomenology. You have to accept the other person's subjectivity, right? Because when you are sick, it does change. I mean, of course, it changes your thinking, but also like the way that you're able to think. At least for me, it does. Like there's
yeah,
this different filter between me and the world. So that's why I feel it's kind of familiar. It's a
yeah. Well, it sounds, I don't doubt. I'm trying to think of the word. Someone used it with me. It's not delusion. It's like like being sort of foggy under drugs, under sedation,
yeah, like
a,
numbness.
a sort of sedated sort of,
Yeah,
um, but what you're saying is you've kind of got this filter between you and the world,
yeah,
that's separating you from the world, and it's very relevant to what I'm doing, the questions I'm asking, and I can't answer it because it depends how we define a global state and how, and if this definition of a global state is useful, how do you move from one to the other? What's the definition of you moving from the normal waking state one day and then kind of getting a cold and moving into this one? What aspects of and again, phenomenology, what aspects of your experience have changed? And say we, to try and be empirical about this, we rate these things from 1 to 7. So we look at your conscious experience and how it changes from this normal waking state to having a cold. What were the things, did your arousal drop? Did you kind of get this, you weren't able to think, you had this brain fog, you kind of like, and then at what point do we say these are different experiences of, because we're not talking about consciousness as this one kind of dimension here. We're talking about these different properties or aspects of consciousness that we theoretically believe can change. And we don't know, like I've taken some out of the literature and measured 13 of them, right? But we don't know which ones are fundamental in our understanding. If you go from the normal waking state to having a cold, what aspects of your experience are fundamental in understanding whether you have changed? Or to start with, what parts of your experience have fundamentally changed? Your qualitative first person experience, and it may be, your thoughts are foggier, your sense of smell has dimmed, your
the outside world feels further away,
like a depersonalization or a derealization sort of feeling. And I mean, these are really fundamental changes, and it does, whether they constitute a different global state, if you look at it, like we have this multi-dimensional space, and we're trying to situate these different ways of being conscious in that. It's kind of like, how far away do you need to be in a different state? And
just the global states. How many are there, and whose research is that based on?
okay, well, it's based mainly on a philosopher called Tim Bain. And he also did a paper with a colleague of his called Jakob Hovey, but they're based at Monash University in Melbourne. But Tim Bain did a few papers with this idea of global states, and it came from the idea that clinicians working with brain damaged patients, and you may have heard this, with drugs maybe, but people talk about levels of consciousness. So you have a coma, is you're not conscious in a coma, then you'll have light anaesthetic, normal waking state, and then amphetamines, and that's kind of in an ascending order. And when they talk about that, they're mainly talking about this one dimension of arousal. A patient, when they try to measure how much brain damage a patient has, it's sort of like, what's that patient's level of arousal or wakefulness? And Tim sort of did this work saying, well, and others did this work where it's, well, we don't just vary in the ways that we're conscious along this kind of one dimension, or one or two dimensions. Instead, there's a whole lot of dimensions that can change when we move from one way of being conscious to another. But in my work, I'm saying, well, how robust is this concept of a global state? And I'm trying to actually measure these domains and using psychosis as an example. So I'm using psychosis as an example and saying, well, does it fit this description of a global state? And I've found problems with that, because the definition I had, sorry, am I raving too much?
so good. This is so good because now you're both explaining what it is, and that actually you are challenging this theory of global states.
Yeah, yeah, and so it's an intuitive sort of concept we have that there are these different ways of being conscious, right? So you would intuitively take that, being under light anesthetic, being drunk, having a cold, which is a totally valid, good example. Being on LSD, they're different ways of being conscious, and then we're saying, well, how are they different?
Mm,
What is it about them that's different, and can we kind of measure that?
mm,
I've measured it with a survey, just saying, asking, like when I measured arousal, saying, asking participants during my last psychotic episode, and they said I was more awake than normal, I was more alert than normal, and then for less arousal, I my mind worked more slowly than normal, I was less alert than normal, and then you work out the average of
mm,
that. And then you say, so if you say that 4 is equivalent to out of from 1 to 7, 4 is equivalent to the normal waking state. I got, for 64 participants, I got 5.19 for arousal.
mm.
And then you do the statistics, and it says, well, that's a significant difference. That's not due to chance, so you'd say that on the whole, in this group, people experienced greater arousal during psychosis than in the normal waking state. And so you try, so again, we have this intuitive idea that there are different ways to be conscious. And so the
Yeah,
work the
because
work to be done is say, well, how are they different? How are these different ways different? And can we measure that in some way? Um and yes, when are there sharp edges? Do we go from one into another, or do we kind of, merge slowly, or yeah.
yeah, yeah. Is it like slightly overlapping, subtly? Interesting. Yeah, it,
Sorry, is it, I don't mean to, because I know when someone talks about their, their work.
yes, but that's what I have this podcast for. Is like I'm pushing that button where I do want to hear. I really do want to hear, and I'm interrupting if I'm not getting it, but I get it, and I get also the excitement of, yeah, this is the discovery, and it's so relatable, even though there's a lot of technical terms and stuff that you know because you've studied this. I think it is relatable to us who care about, well, I think most of my listeners will have a spiritual nerve, right? It's relatable because we care about who we are and our experience and how it can change. I think I just, yeah, recently had a conversation with someone about it, that a lot of the things that I do is trying to alter my consciousness, is trying to get some experience other than just I am my body and I have this identity, even if it's just slight changes, if it's just like listening to music, just anything to just get me into that sense of there's something more. So that's, it's relatable to however you work with yourself, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And one of your questions, you mentioned meditation,
Yeah.
and we often think about meditation as putting us in, more refined states of consciousness, perhaps because, yeah, I mean, obviously, when you sit and meditate, it's a challenge and you get a lot of internal chatter. But, the goal is, hopefully to step back from that, and, or when you get caught up in it, to come back to your breath or whatever, so
Yeah.
the goal, without being too, you know, hubristic or anything, is to hopefully refine, uh, uh, well, to become more present with our experience, by not being caught up. Uh,
Mm. But I also
um,
like the word refinement. I like the word refinement as well, like refining what it is that I sense with, and the whole being aware of awareness, all of that is, yeah, I like that. It just
Yeah.
goes a little bit beyond. But then, like you say, not romanticizing, and I really agree with you on that. Not romanticizing leaving your personality, anything, because we are here in the physical dimension, and that is difficult, and it has to be, and we have to be here in the flesh and blood. So um, yeah, so it's not like romanticizing, not having a reality structure. We need that. Yeah, I wanted to use a little bit of time also on your birth chart, Shauna. How do you feel about astrology?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I'm not into astrology,
Okay,
but
okay.
but having said that, I used to throw the I Ching a lot, and so like I believe we can find meaningful patterns, so and I'm a Jungian, so
Right.
like I did a degree in analytical psychology, Jung, and I so I come from that background.
Yeah. So
But astrology is not been something I've got into. But anyway.
okay, but you're in that background of symbolic thinking, I assume.
Yeah, sure. I do think that there is a way of seeing or being in the world where there's a lot of synchronicity and things connect up. And I think it in our normal waking state, we're often closed to those sort of symbols or to that synchronicity, and that's a shame. But I do think that's a way of being in the world that we sadly miss out on.
Mm.
But maybe at the same time we can't function in the world if we're living that way.
Kind of what I was just trying to philosophize over as well. Yeah, like the balance of that. Yeah, I get it. Okay. So you don't know your birth chart, correct?
I don't think so. No,
Okay.
no.
I can say anything. Great. um but I was looking at it, and there's so much always to dive into, but then I thought, here's the thing, and that is that the ruler or your ascendant is Mercury, good for research, and it's in the eighth house. So the eighth, I can't even say that word, even though I say it a lot, eight house. And that is everything that's unconscious. Like often it's like darkness, and it's a Scorpio archetype, and you also have some planets then in Scorpio. So it's that deeper dive into darkness. But I'm also thinking, yeah, darkness, but it's not necessarily negative. It's anything unconscious, really. And so now Mercury, being a good researcher, being someone who communicates, is going to talk about that, and it's in Capricorn, so that is very good for your work. So it's a it's a really potent placement. It always is the ruler over our ascendant, um, and so I just thought, that's that. Of course, you are an Aquarius, so that is also researching, discovering anything that can lead us into a better society. But just that Mercury, I found, okay, I think that's really what you're doing right now as well, together with your Aquarian energy, of course. But doing that also like step by step, and can we measure it, and how can we make it reliable, and let's not, because if it was only Aquarius, you might go way into space. So this Mercury is really keeping you down to earth about it as well. Like, let's see what are the results, and let's do it the hard way, actually. So it's reliable facts that comes through, and then it's in that field. The houses are the areas, right? So it's that area of wonder what are they experiencing underneath the surface there, and that other reality, talking about it, caring about it, being a little bit obsessed about it.
I I take it from Jung as, I think I was very imbalanced with my personality in terms of being very left of field, coming from drugs, psychosis, Jung, Buddhism,
Oh,
this sort of a background, and then needing that kind of rational grounding
right.
to to kind of counter balance that.
Absolutely.
And so that's where this uni work kind of, which has been a very slow, I'm not good, I have not been I've been a very slow student, you know, and it's not easy for me, but this sort of training has been to kind of balance my personality to, you know, to become more rigorous or whatever. And that really is a lesson from Jung about, because when we're very left of field with our ideas, or you know, mystical or spiritual, whatever, if we don't ground that back into something more solid, we can, exactly what you said, you know, kind of float away,
Yeah.
you know.
That's so interesting. So you actually come from a background of openness, if you could reduce it to that. And then you had these experiences, and then to balance it out, you say then you've stayed more connected to reliable reality facts. Is that how it is?
No, I would say I went on a path for a lot. I look, you know, I started smoking pot when I was 15, 16,
Okay.
very depressed for a long time, psychotic, and maybe ecstasy, acid when I was, you know, 19 or whatever. Psychotic by the age of 21, 3 psychotic episodes, and got into Buddhism, got into Jung. And it was really this, you know, from a young age, as a teenager, you're aware that consciousness shifts, you know, you're aware that reality can be very different.
Yeah.
And so it was in a sense a spiritual journey, you know. It has been, but then I did get into this academic work as a way of I this sounds so pathetic, but as a way of trying to be credible, you know, and not just in terms of how people perceive me, but in terms of being able to think clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. This is so good. This is your Mercury there in Capricorn being, yeah, credible. And yeah, it's no, I don't see that it's just to in front of other people. It's for your own foundation as well, your own groundedness in reality, because that Mercury has sensed a lot of stuff, and that's probably the need to get away from that as well in your young years. And then as an adult, you've been able to really heighten that archetype.
It sounds like you have that balance.
Oh yeah, I'm
You
totally
work for that
balanced.
balance.
I'm a very balanced person. You know, I don't have mistakes. I don't have any flaws. Oh no, yeah. It's a constant. It's a constant. And often in my life I've had that question, should I trust? Should I just trust life and go with it? Or should I actually accept reality like everyone is telling me to do it? So it's not a yes or no. But that's why I am constantly seeking, um, because I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. And it's not like a seeking that's um it's a fun seeking as well. And it's like a little bit inspired of what you said with that psychotic episode of everything is a game. I mean, sometimes that's how I can translate reality is, okay, I have to figure this one out somehow. Not from here, but from actually opening up more sources inside of me, more channels inside of me. Yeah. Does it make
Yeah.
sense?
Well,
So so for me, the spiritual journey for me is around how the fuck do I stay here? Like how do I do this physical thing? Because that's the difficult part for me. The difficult part is not being spiritual. The difficult part is actually being here. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I, I mean, certainly I have a lot of problems with the being here in terms of anxiety and, you know, so,
Yeah.
but I guess you're putting yourself out in the world. You know, I'm probably a lot more quiet I'm guessing because of the podcast, and
Mm.
you're probably a lot more connected to the world. I guess I live maybe a bit more,
Yeah, but
you know.
I know that as the anxiety is exactly what I meant. Like any, so yeah, that's I have that side of me that then exposes everything, but that's not even where what the difficulty is about. The difficulty is about like just my own physical life, and like yeah, anxiety comes, all of these things that are happening, um, and then well, constantly thinking spiritual and physical together rather than separate, right? Like my body is my mind. It's the same thing. Not thinking, oh no, I have to take this to the doctor. Look at it. Like it's also, I have to do with it. I have to do with everything.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's
I
mystery.
I would say I haven't practiced, like I just being present, to the little moments that are joyful, and
Yeah.
like that. That's enough of a practice, to come into the moment and appreciate, and creating a safe environment,
Okay.
like away from people who, you know,
Yeah.
aren't healthy, and then in that safe environment. I'm not giving advice, I'm just saying what I'm doing, but I would like to, when my university work is more complete, spend more time uh learning to be more present. But I
Mm.
think being more present, I think today, and someone did a visualization with us, and they said, and this was, we were had our eyes shut, we were visualizing, we're in a forest, and then there's a clearing, and on the other side of the clearing there's a deer, and the deer spots you and it freezes and it looks at you. Okay, now what do you do to get the deer to approach you? And for me, I just sat down in a
Oh,
meditative position and shut my eyes. It was just being very calm. And
yeah.
then the person leading the visualization said, okay, now you're a school counselor behind a desk, and a parent brings a child in, and the parent is yelling at the child, and the child's all stooped over, and you know, like it's like, how do you approach the child, when the parent leaves? And for me, I just had this, I was sitting in my headmistress's seat behind a desk, and I saw my mother bring me into the office yelling at me, and it was the first time I'd seen that from another perspective, and how harsh that is. And
Yeah.
and I think the goal of this visualization, if if I take it correctly, is just how to be present,
Yeah.
and what that compassionate being present is about. And it's kind of a non-doing, it is just sitting compassionately with suffering or fear or whatever. So I interpreted it as what is a safe space. And maybe these are the sort of lessons that we want to embody, that take a lifetime,
Yeah. Oh, that is so good. I really like that you said that. Oh yeah, that's really good. And so that's also what I mean about constantly wanting to alter my consciousness. Is just even that, just visualizing and having the spontaneous imaginations coming up, and that being therapeutic, at least if it's a space that's someone is facilitating for you. And so yeah, absolutely. Finding the balance, it is a constant, and I think it's just so important, the work that you're doing, right? With this opening up for who, what we are, right?
Yeah. Well, the uni stuff can get a bit heady, you
Mm,
know, but uh, um, but like the real stuff is the, you know, how do we learn to be, present in our body, present with others,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's a good way to say it. Yeah. Yeah. It's really good. I feel this conversation has also brought different states, at least in me. Very aroused in the beginning, excited. And yeah, don't you think? And then something here in the end came that was a little from another channel, if you can call it that. And 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 afterwards that's gonna come security. Did I say the wrong thing? I didn't say the whole thing. It's
No, I thank you. It's been really lovely meeting you. So,
Thank you so much, Shauna. Thank you so much.